Welcome to the second to last Wednesday 5 o'clock event in our year-long series on the theme of choice here at the Wolf Humanities Center. I'm Sophia Rosenfeld, topic director for this theme, and also a faculty member in the history department at Penn. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity this afternoon of introducing, listening to, and then talking with Abosede George, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Barnard, and our guest for today's program entitled What Kids Can't Do, Youth, Historical Agency and Authority. We see this event as an opportunity to investigate choice from yet another perspective. That is to think about children's and young people's ability to exercise deliberate choices and to act autonomously, which is what historians often call agency. And also to think about how that power has varied temporally and spatioculturally and under different political regimes, as well as by race, by gender, by class, and critically too by age. And I should add that the question of children's agency as historical actors is a very live and contentious one for historians at the moment, but that this debate has implications for fields and subjects ranging from human rights to children's literature. And that's why we're so eager to hear from Professor George as part of this series. And here she is. Briefly, Abosede George received her BA from Rutgers, almost down the street, and then her PhD on the other coast from Stanford in 2006. The next year, she joined the Barnard faculty, where she's since taught and written about the urban history of Africa, the history of migration, women, gender, and the history of sexuality in Africa, and especially of interest to us today, the history of childhood and youth in Africa. The latter focus is especially evident in her 2014 book, Making Modern Girls, A History of Girlhood, Labor, and Social Development, which won the Edu Snyder Prize from the African Studies Association Women's Caucus, and also from the courses she teaches, such as Childhood and Youth in Modern Africa. She's now, I gather, continuing to write about Nigerian history with a focus on Lagos in particular, but this time looking at reverse migration and reverse diaspora in the 19th and early 20th centuries, including building a digital archive on the topic. We had hoped that tonight's conversation would be between Professor George and Professor Mia Bay of the history department here at Penn, my colleague. But Professor Bay was unable to be here, I'm sorry to say, and so I'm taking her place. Our plan is to listen to Professor George talk about her own work and the history of childhood more broadly for the first part of the program. And then I will ask her a few questions to get our discussion going. And then finally, we will open up the conversation to the audience. As always, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen at any point from now going forwards, and we'll get to as many as time allows. So a big thank you to our audience, as well as to Professor George for being here now. Thank you to our co-sponsor, the history department here at Penn. Thank you to our wonderful Wolf Humanities staff that makes these programs possible and then so expertly run. And now over to you, Abosede.
First, I want to unmute. Thank you, Sophie, as I was saying, for that introduction. Thank you as well to the Wolf Humanities Center for inviting me to contribute to your ongoing conversation on the theme of choice and to speak on tonight's specific topic on youth and agency. I also want to thank Karen Redrobe and Sarah Varney, Sarah Malinsky, and the interpreters for all your help with tonight's event. And of course, to the audience, I look forward to our conversation. My remarks are going to be based on a contribution I made to a 6-volume project, which is coming out with Bloomsbury Publishers. And this project is entitled The Cultural History of Youth from Antiquity to the Modern Age. Each of the 6 volumes in this project has the same set of 10 chapter headings, beginning with concepts of youth and ending with world contexts. We're looking at agency and authority, labor and education, gender, sexuality and the body, 7 other themes. And a priority of the project was to approach these chapters through a trans-regional or even a global history lens. Editors sought to draw out perspectives that decentered Europe and North America, which are two regions of the world that are overrepresented in historical studies of childhood and youth. We were curious about what new perspectives on the actual global history of youth might be revealed by our extending our gaze from European youth to equally taking in the remaining young people of the world. One of my contributions to the larger project is a chapter on agency and authority in the volume that deals with the age of imperialism, so basically the 19th century. And in the first part of this talk, I'm going to be pulling from my reflections in that chapter on youth, agency, and empire. And in the second part, I'm going to offer some final thoughts on what children and youth studies can contribute to our thinking about the concept of agency. The key questions I asked when thinking about youth, agency, and empire were: one, what difference did imperial structures of authority make to youth agency? Two, what difference did youth make to empire? Like most issues, there are at least two ways of looking at either of these questions. Authority structures in the age of empire could be either enhancing or constraining of the agency of young people, depending on how their status as youth intersected with issues of class, race, gender, and depending on place and period in the 19th century. The age of empire enshrined new conditions of racialization and also of what I'd call youthing. And while racialization always imposed constraints on individual agency, youthing had more ambiguous effects. And it had more ambiguous effects depending on where and when you were in the imperial world. One thing to note is that empire enabled encounters between youth from different parts of the world. There is a scene from Chinua Achebe's celebrated debut novel, Things Fall Apart, that I found useful for imagining such encounters and their complicated effects. In the scene, which I'm about to read, an Igbo father and son come into contact with a missionary, perhaps a young missionary. One remains unaffected by this meeting, and the other is completely transformed. The missionary ignored him and went on to talk about the Holy Trinity. At the end of it, Okonkwo was fully convinced the man was mad. He shrugged his shoulders and went away to tap his afternoon palm wine. But there was a lad who had been captivated. His name was Nwoye, Okonkwo's first son. It was not the mad logic of the Trinity that captivated him. He did not understand it. It was the poetry of the new religion, something felt in the marrow. The hymn about brothers who sat in darkness and in fear seemed to answer a vague and persistent question that haunted his young soul. The question of the twins crying in the bush, and the question of Ikemefuna, who was killed. He felt a relief within as the hymn poured into his parched soul. The words of the hymn were like the drops of frozen rain melting on the dry palate of the panting earth. Nwoye's callow mind was greatly puzzled. So the novel was set in the fictional village of Umuofia in southeastern Nigeria in the 1890s. This is the moment in the story when Nwoye, the protagonist's teenage son, or the lad, as Achebe called them, first grasps the possibility of living otherwise. Whereas his father, Okonkwo, effortlessly shrugs off the missionary's call and remains securely ensconced within the hold of Umuofia village traditions. The younger Nwoye listens to the strange Christian hymns with feelings of longing and relief. And by the end of the novel, you find Okonkwo, the defender of traditional lifeways, hanging from a tree. He's committed suicide, and his life and death are then summarized in a fictional colonial ethnography entitled The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. Nwoye, meanwhile, goes on to leave Umuofia to seek Western-style education at one of the new teacher training colleges. And there he learns new notions of civilization and later plays a role in introducing Western colonial knowledge systems into his home communities. By one reading, the important duality in the scene is between the father and son, Okonkwo and Nwoye. But there is the third character, the missionary, is also present and whose presence raises several interesting questions. Achebe does not tell us if the missionary was a young man, but we could easily imagine him as such. Nwoye, by contrast, was specifically identified as a youth. Imperial formations enabled this encounter between the missionary and Nwoye, as well as the complicated opportunities that the youth would acquire to reshape himself and his corner of the imperial world. Nwoye's transformations, which are first internal and then externalized, gave rise to a shift in the significance of youth that may have been particular to the colonial era. Where youth previously had signified junior status, exclusion from public power, the economic and logistical needs of the colonial system of rule made youthfulness an asset to those who were keen to access new forms of knowledge, power, and authority. I want to think with Nwoye for several reasons. First, because he experiences the shift from having one form of authority as a force bearing down on him to acquiring another form that becomes a tool he wields upon others. Second, Nwoye is helpful to think with because he's representative of the vast majority of youth in the age of empire who were colonial subjects. When young colonial subjects encountered young imperial agents, such as the missionary might have been, how were their respective relationships to agency and authority similar and different? This excerpt from Chinua Achebe's classic, I think, draws attention to how intersections between youth status and other categories of minoritization, which varied across space, may have shaped authority structures and the possibilities for expressing youth agency in the age of empire. I want to pay attention to the particularity of colonial or metropolitan contexts within and outside of broader empire formations, and ask how agentive possibilities for youth were shaped by their geographic, their social, their legal locations within empire. One way I deal with this is by looking comparatively at African youth on the continent and Afro-descendant youth in the Atlantic diaspora during the Age of Empire. What is meant by the Age of Empire here refers to the new imperialism that saw the extension of European imperial power over all but a handful of polities in Africa and its islands, as well as through much of East and Southeast Asia. And in the Age of Empire, multiple empires overlapped. Japan's empire, the Qing Empire in China, the remains of the Mughal Empire in India, all witnessed the extension of British, French, Spanish, and American empire into Asia. The Ottomans, the Ethiopian Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, the Zulu Empire, also witnessed the encroachment of European power into Africa from the mid-1800s into the mid-20th century. Thus, the Age of Empire in parts of Africa and Asia was by definition also the age of colonization. Yet the same period in other parts of the world was post-imperial. Freed from European imperial control, new republics in the western part of the Atlantic world were sorting through the legacies of 4 centuries of European overrule. Along the Americas and in the Caribbean, the post-empire period overlapped with their age of emancipation. And in post-imperial, post-slavery societies, freed people presented and embodied new questions about freedom, nation, citizenship, agency, and authority. By the end of the 19th century, continental Africa was entering into its phase of European colonial domination. At the same time, the last slave labor-based colonies in the Western Hemisphere were being made to abandon slavery as the basis of their systems of production. So agentive possibilities for young people in such times were shaped not just by their particular contextual identities, but also by these broader processes of abolition, colonization, and imperial expansion. The pacification of indigenous African societies was directed by young European soldiers, sailors, colonial officers, and missionaries, who were imagined on the basis of their youthful vigor to be the ones most capable of withstanding the rigors of tropical climates. In colonial territories, European imperialism provided new pathways for young men, particularly young working class European men, to enhance their social status, to accelerate their social adulthood, and to exercise real power over the lives of others. Many of these others were, these colonized others were young as well. Colonial youth were put through novel colonial mechanisms like missionary societies, plantations, mines, Western-style schools, factory systems, colonial militias. Although these new mechanisms existed in order to serve the overarching cause of colonial extraction, they also sought to make use of young colonial subjects, more specifically young men, as a strategic group within the subject population. And this sometimes presented opportunities for youth to subvert more long-standing, quote unquote, traditional authority structures, what Paul Achenbach refers to as elder states. Thus, youth, especially male youth, found openings to exercise agency within the colonial order. Take, for instance, the example of mining industries in Southern Africa. The discovery of diamonds and gold in Southern Africa in the mid-19th century engendered the rise of mining monopolies that funneled young male workers into elaborately organized regional migrant labor systems. Similar dynamics were observed in the commercial farming industries in the same regions and period. Earlier economic changes that compelled Africans to participate in the colonial cash economy ensured that able-bodied youth would be sent from throughout the Southern African subcontinent to work in the mines. And in short order, going to the mines became a masculine rite of passage out of the stage of youth, out of the status of youth. Young mine workers were able to accumulate resources as individuals independently of their rural homestead patriarchs. Unskilled laborers were able to find employment in the mines, and this too favored the young. The complexity lies in the tensions between the coercive labor demands of the mining industry, the overarching context of the extractive settler colonial economy, which expropriated both land and male labor from African societies, and the individualist freedoms that this new system afforded some able-bodied young men. So the colonial mining economy provided some young men with opportunities to act as individuals and express attenuated forms of agency. Similar dynamics, as I said, were observed in the commercial agriculture sector. The rise of large-scale plantation enterprises across Southern and East Africa brought with it land seizures, population displacement, and labor market manipulations that forced able-bodied Africans into the service of European landowners. In Southern Rhodesia, young migrant laborers were seasonally employed on commercial farms. Many were compelled by the logic of household economies, in which young people were assigned to perform wage work by which their homesteads could earn the cash required for colonial tax payments. Sometimes, as Beverly Greer documented in her study of child workers in colonial Southern Rhodesia, young people were kidnapped, they were closed in, and forced to labor on settler-owned plantation farms. Yet at other times, young people would seek out employment on settler farms in order to access cash and a certain degree of autonomy. In West Africa, scholars from Paul Lovejoy to Robin Chapdelaine have noted that the end of the Atlantic slave trade at the beginning of the 19th century produced a spike in slaveholding within West African middleman states. Going into the 19th century and in its early decades, young people were preferred for capture as they were seen to be less able to resist, less likely to escape, and more easily assimilated into new communities. The later imposition of direct colonial rule in the second half of the 19th century did not introduce substantive changes to these unfree labor practices. Across the French and British empires, colonial administrations, driven to maximize the profitability of extractive economies, found ways of recasting unfree labor as necessary for social stability. Abolition, by contrast, was cast as threatening to the legitimization of colonial regimes and to the authority of local leaders. Thus, forms of unfree labor such as pawnship, slave marriage, and other forms centering upon young people, particularly young women, were accommodated by ascendant colonial authorities. Yet even within contexts of unfree labor, young people still found ways to express their agency by absconding, by joining rebel armies, and so on. Empire's enabling of individualism stood in tension with its emphasis on extraction in ways that created openings for some youth to forge new ways of being in their societies. So individualism, capitalism, the cash economies, the demand for cheap labor, these created new opportunities for youth to exercise individual agency. Crossing the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean, the 19th century saw a 400-year-old socioeconomic system financed by the continuous exploitation of millions of enslaved people, gradually morphing into a new kind of economic system that would revolve around the continuous operation of industrial machines. And over the course of 4 centuries, the Atlantic slave trade had created racialized people and racially ordered societies across Western Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean. The end of the trade had certain repercussions for young people. One repercussion had to do with the fact that the abolition of the slave trade did not immediately eliminate the market for new sources of enslaved labor. Rather, it drove the market underground. The 19th century witnessed surreptitious trading and increased interest in young people as commodities of trade. Children were smaller than adults, which allowed for more young people to be transported in slave ships. Young people were less likely to plot uprisings or engage in marronage. Young people were also considered to be more adaptable to the new environments. So the period following the rollout of bans on interoceanic slave trading witnessed a rise in purchases of youth in particular, and engendered purchases. There was a preference for trading in African youth, but more particularly for girls and young women. Young women and girls became highly valued by committed slavers in the Western Hemisphere who hoped to replenish their enslaved labor pools by means of sexual reproduction. Eventually, however, the 19th century concluded with formerly enslaved people gaining legal emancipation. But the process of weaning off the addiction to slave labor prompted the proliferation of various forms of unfree labor. Transitioning from slave labor-based societies to ones in which citizenship was radically expanded gave rise to the production of interstitial civil statuses. In effect, when emancipation came to the Americas, the Caribbean, this caused the age of empire to overlap with the post-slavery era. And in Europe, the Americas and Caribbean, the legacy of slavery was carried forward in new disguises, or in new guises, rather, not disguises. In post-slavery societies, one strategy was to import indentured labor. Another, to intensify the use of prison labor populations, who could be exploited in much the same way as slaves had been. Another strategy that authorities adopted was to institute apprenticeships. These were mandatory, extended, and renewable apprenticeships for newly freed people. And they extended the experience of subordination and kept the full rights of adult citizenship out of the reach of those who had been freed. Apprenticeship laws exerted a youthing effect upon individuals who could be forcibly apprenticed. under apprenticeship laws, which extended unfree labor practices into a free labor system. Compensation, or the lack thereof, rather than the kind of labor one engaged in, served as the mark of junior status, right, or youth. For young people, long-term apprenticeships were one of a number of strategies that ruling classes deployed to try and perpetuate their access to free and almost free labor. And apprenticeships became really common in strongholds of European settlement. By the application and combination of racial and generational logics of hierarchy, young people of color were made particularly vulnerable to being pressed into unfree labor situations. We can look to Latin America for examples of how apprenticeships were racialized and centered on the young. Nara Milanich's study of the widespread language of tutelary servitude demonstrates the reach and the racialization of youth apprenticeships in post-emancipation societies. Practices of tutelary servitude were characterized by the combination of, quote, relationships of subordination and labor exploitation with paternalistic ideas of protection and charity, end quote. Tutelary servitude was widespread throughout Latin America and became increasingly significant, systematic, and widely accepted precisely in the 19th century with the putative adoption of freedom and liberty as core political values of the new post-imperial Republican states. Children known as criados, who were generally of non-European background and who were cast into servile roles, often through strategies resembling kidnapping, raiding, or even sale, could be found across the former Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas. Also known by a variety of locally derived names, depending on the region, the historical fact of criados attests to the particular value of young people to systems of authority in the 19th century imperial and post-imperial world. In places swept up in the emancipationist currents of the 19th century, which had led to bans on slave trading and finally the abolition of slavery, we also find that the addiction to social and economic systems built on the exploitation of enslaved labor was hard to shake. Across Latin America, young Amerindians and Afro-descendant youth were most likely to be drafted into the criado category to fill the labor gaps. One may wonder, where's the youth agency in all of this? By taking up the idea of patiency, we can presume the agentiveness of those who appeared passive, who bore witness, or who survived their times. In the second edition of Freedom on My Mind, the US historians Deborah Gray White, Waldo Martin, and Mia Bay, who couldn't be here, close a chapter entitled Black Life and Culture During the Nadir, 1800 to 1915. They close the chapter with a photograph of 4 young Black men posed in prison stripes. This is a famous photograph titled A Southern Chain Gang. It's freely accessible from the Library of Congress. We have all probably seen it many times, or at least many variations of it, so I feel no need to show it here. The image invites the question of what agency it might look like in a closed system. The photo caption tells us, Convict labor in the South assumed two major forms: prison farms and chain gangs. The latter in particular were a feature of Southern urban and rural life between the late 19th century, when Southern states instituted the use of chain gangs, and the 1950s, when these states formally abolished the practice. This photograph of members of a Southern Black chain gang reveals both their humanity and their dehumanization. The image invites the viewer's attention and concern because the subjects are looking directly, yet non-threateningly, at the camera. Their youth is signaled by their lack of facial hair, and the chains, striped uniforms, and work axes clearly convey their criminalization. The young men in the photo stand close to each other in the center of the photograph, as they're framed by a towering building in the background. Each of their smooth, dark faces, shaded with a wide brim hat, is pierced with either a sharp look of expectation or a weary, faraway stare. The world and times that the youth lived in valued them only as laboring bodies and sought to minimize absolutely the cost of their work. The nadir followed a brief phase of social and political advancement for Black people that came after the abolition of slavery in the US. During this time, the overwhelming experience the recently freed and their descendants had was one of marginalization and disenfranchisement. In the southern region of the country, segregation laws were passed that enshrined Black inferiority in the public sphere. Black voting rights were rolled back, while courts and commercial farmers colluded to trick landless people into entering endless debt peonage agreements. And weekly publicized lynchings terrorized Black communities, while Southern whites were emboldened to act as a ubiquitous vigilante racial policing force. And young people like the four pictured in A Southern Chain Gang were ensnared by means of 1,000 pretenses into perpetuating the enslaved labor routines that the nation had been built with. And yet, in this context of relentless repression, they persisted, which brings us back to the consideration of patiency. A theory of patiency, the capacity to be acted on and exist, helps to release us from the agential bias of agency studies that overvalues those who are already privileged, bodily, economically, politically, and racially. Whereas youth agency is frequently analyzed as being directed against hegemonic institutions, by turning our attention toward patiency, the feelings, experiences, endurances, and other low register responses to institutions and systems of repression, we can better glean how multiply marginalized youth, particularly those with archivally subtle records, might have expressed agency within hegemonic systems of authority. Although she doesn't use the same terms, the work of Marisa Fuentes on enslaved women in the Caribbean has been helpful for thinking about this. The concept of agency generally calls up associations with physicality, the body acting on other bodies, taking up space, resisting other bodies, and in so doing, imposing transformation around itself. And this view of agency reflects a deeply embedded bias that is problematic on gender, racial, and historical grounds. The agential conception of persons arises from a bias towards the active and powerful individual. What Reader calls the agential bias predisposes us to seek out agency and celebrate it as a confirmation of full humanity. Conversely, what appears to be an absence of agency reads as an actual absence of humanity and as a problem to be resolved. you can see how the agential bias has dire implications for the conquered, the silenced, the colonized. In other words, the vast majority of people who lived in the age of empire. Now I think I want to come to some closing thoughts on agency. I think agency as a concept has been richly explored across many disciplines and fields. Historians adopting social history, cultural history, or subaltern history approaches have found the concept particularly generative for discussing archivally subtle traces of personhood, presence, or power. And by archivally subtle, I mean that agency is this property that one has to dig for in the archives. Agency is not presumed to be already present, but scholars can assign it to historical actors, particularly those actors who need to be reimagined in the present as having been active in the past. And for this paradoxical reason, subordinated populations, like children and youth, have played a central animating role in the scholarship on agency. I am ambivalent about the notion that scholars of children and youth are obliged to address the agency question at all, the agency of the people they work on. I think historians trained in the global north start with agency as a problematic, as a question, because in Western thought, we start with the individual as the basic social unit. Extending that, we start with the cis, hetero, Western, white, able-bodied, male, adult individual as the basic subject of history. And only gradually and with deep skepticism and reluctance have other subjects been allowed near the central frame. We've been operating with an assimilationist view of humanity, within which agency or the ascription of agency functions to integrate new subjects into humanity. Agency studies have gone from consideration of the enslaved to women to subaltern subjects, creating an expanding zone of who is presumed to be agential. But there's an interesting pause that takes place with consideration of children. Scholars of children and youth are still asked to make the case. The gradualism of bringing new subjects into the central concerns of history tends to reify all sorts of center-periphery binaries, including the centrality of the original, authentic subject of serious history, who I've already named. There are other starting points for understanding the human, other epistemologies, ones where agency is presumed as a quality of all beings. And we need to look horizontally beyond European philosophical traditions if we are to shift imaginatively in our thinking on this issue. Sarah Maza argued that the presence of agency as an explanation or a conclusion was a weakness of many histories of childhood and youth. I don't disagree, but I would add that casting agency as a central conceptual category that we need to deal with itself hampers our imagination of the child, particularly outside of European and Euro-American history. That said, Sarah Maza also asked a very challenging and productive question in her recent AHR review article. What does thinking through the lens of children and youth help us do with the concept of agency? Seems to me that centering children enables us to contain the agential bias and the fiction of individualism that it is built on. Taking a children and youth lens as a starting point tends to foreground other dimensions of being human, our interdependency, our vulnerability, our dependence on others, including those who dominate us, and related paradoxes of being human. The last natural hierarchy in social life lies in the relationship between social children and social adults. In much of the world, adult dominance over children and youth is understood as a natural reflection of age difference, a natural outcome of age difference. The naturalization of hierarchical difference between people has a history. We emphasize activist demands, violence, and the threat of violence as drivers of transformation that push back against the naturalness of various kinds of hierarchical difference, or various ideas of hierarchical difference. But the fact is that the demands from the so-called periphery have to be met with a response from the so-called center. The expansion of humanity has to be demanded and also answered. There's nothing inevitable in that process. The dismantling of the center, I think, is the point of non-Western histories and even of children's histories. And coming back to the title of this evening's talk, what kids can't do. Well, dismantling the discipline centers and the world's ideas of the center and the center periphery binaries is one thing kids can't do, but that the study of children and youth can help to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry it took me a moment to get unmuted and back on the screen. That was terrifically interesting insofar as you went all the way from sort of experiential childhood to conceptualizations of childhood. And I have to say that the question I have for you is quite untheoretical but it made me very curious, which is to say, of course, historians have been studying childhood for a while in a lot of different ways, but it's never been really a mainstream subject in some ways, perhaps for the reasons that you've just laid out. And I'm curious how you came to your own interest in writing about childhood and especially girlhood. Was it out of an interest in the experience of childhood or out of the kind of theoretical issues that you've just laid out? If you'd be willing to tell us a little bit about what drew your interest in this direction initially.
I think thank you for that question. And I'm answering that question years after having written about girlhood and having, so I'm not sure how I would have answered it, in 2014. But I think what drew me actually was that I was interested in how power worked within Nigerian societies, and the tensions between the kind of the resistance, for lack of a better word, to the imposition of colonial powers on adults, and that's its coexistence with imposition of power by the upper classes over the working classes, by adults over children, the various forms of inequality that were preserved within the society at the same time as there's a kind of growing, robust critique of inequality within a colonial world, right, against a colonial state. Yeah. And I think I settled upon the girl figure as one who, due to kind of gendered logics of inequality, racialized logics of inequality in a colonial world, and um, gerontocratic ideas, right, in which
Mhm.
the young person should be minoritized. I thought that particular lens, that particular subject, to look from that particular subject would, I think, illuminate the widest range of the widest kind of perspective I could get on the contradictions of how power and inequalities were preserved, right, within African societies at the same time as they was being critiqued against the colonial state. So I think I was just looking for, I think the girl represented to me at the time the kind of most, the furthest extreme from the normative empowered agential subject, right? And seemed to me to have the clearest view on, provide the clearest view on power in its multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderfully evocative. I like very much your suggestion that rather than sit around and worry about whether children have always had agency or never had agency or how much, that maybe we start thinking differently about agency itself, or find a new category altogether to start thinking about children's lives. It's a very compelling argument. I wonder if that means then that you see children as in some ways commensurate with other marginalized groups or other people with limited power. People often make analogies between women's history, for instance, and the history of children within any given society. Or do you see children, including girls, as somehow fundamentally different because childhood not only runs across race and class and all other kinds of cleavages, but it has this strange, its strangest quality is that one exits its identity. Everybody necessarily grows out of being a child. All those girls become women at some point. So I'm wondering whether you see a kind of parallelism, and you just pointed out that girls are particularly disempowered in most places by reasons of age and gender, and many other factors as well, or whether there's something unusual about children per se as a category.
I think I agree with you that, you know, and Sarah Maza makes this point too in her article, that one of the peculiarities of children is that they are a, you know, they're the category that, you know, at the same time as everyone on earth has a history of childhood, was a child at one point, right? Like everyone has that as a kind of past tense. Will have that as a kind of past tense at some point. Do I think that there's something absolutely distinct about children as a historical subject to think through, to think with? I mean, I think, you know, what I was trying to suggest at the end was that positioning, you know, children as the central subject, right, of our consideration, as a central subject of our consideration, as our representation of the human. I think what it allows us to do, or what it should push us, the direction it would push us in, is in a direction that that foregrounds, or at least attends to the equal, you know, the equality between our agency, our power, our ability to exert ourselves as humans upon the earth, but also our vulnerability, our fundamental vulnerability to being acted upon, and our interdependence with others, right, and our dependence on others. And I think that all of those, both of those qualities, right, the quality of agency and then the quality of vulnerability and the qualities of power and weakness are present in all humans. But I think that children as the subject, it's the subject of our imagination about human experiences, human history, draw out, right, that balance, I think, more immediately, and draw out those kind of often not neglected, but kind of subordinated dimensions of being human that the normative adult male subject I think doesn't as readily bring us to. So I think children, starting with the child as the subject of the imagination, I think starts us somewhere different, and starts us somewhere different, and brings us to somewhere different in thinking about the human. I think there are analogies made between the comparisons are made between women's history and children's history, but increasingly I'm wondering if disability studies might be something that helps us think about, that does some similar work, and probably more directly and more clearly than children's history did, because children's history, I'm not sure was as concerned with thinking about power, ability, disability, inclusion in the same ways. More and more studies are, right? And especially those that are being done on children outside of Europe, Euro-American kind of traditional historiography. But I'm wondering if, I'm thinking that maybe disability studies might be more related.
Yeah. Well, you've obviously touched a nerve here, because you're getting a lot of interesting questions, and they sort of are in two categories: people who are interested in some of the specifics of claims that you made in the talk, and then also a lot of questions precisely about this thinking about who has agency and how to talk about children, what vocabulary we can use, and even this question of the category of children itself. Is children, youth, students, all of which have sort of normative qualities about them, but for any historian are really variable categories too. So let me read you a few, and maybe I'll even read you more than one at a time if you don't mind.
Sure.
And so here's somebody who is very interested in your reading of Achebe and Things Fall Apart, and the suggestion that youth are often first in their families to learn the language of the dominant group, both in colonial missionary settings and in diaspora immigrant communities. What kind of agency does this give them as intermediaries between the system and either their families or marginalized communities?
I like to think about agency as being inherent to all beings, right? And the question is how does it get exercised, right? So it's a capacity that you have. It can get exercised to larger or lesser degrees depending on the opportunities you have, depending on the situation, what the needs of the situation. I think with that question, clearly the acting as an intermediary, mediating the experience of the immigrant parent, or and their interactions with the society. In those actions, they're expressing their agency. I don't think that there is a kind of agency that they're exerting, but it's an expression of a quality that they already have. Agency is it's like the quality of intelligence or something, right? Where your different situations and different questions require different levels of your intelligence, right? Different forms of your intelligence. But the intelligence itself is not in question, right? So I think for me, agency is it's closer to even consciousness than something that that can be kind of, okay, I might be going too far there, but I would stick with the intelligence analogy, right? That it's just a quality of being human that can get exercised in different ways or expressed in different ways depending on the situation.
So yes, I mean, and a number of people and I've skipped from my questions directly to the audience because there's so many good ones from the audience, I'm going to have to save mine for another time. That some people want to know, precisely building on what you just said, kind of, are there takeaways from this that go beyond history? Somebody writes here, for instance, I work in criminal law theory. There are lots of questions these days in American criminal law theory about childhood, including questions about how childhood matters interact with other matters like race. Should lawyers, philosophers, sociologists also be wary of using agency talk in the way that they often do? Are there lessons non-historians should take from your work?
Oh, great
That's
question.
a very small question for you.
Huge question, tough field, especially with how the American criminal system works differently on different children.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think that the field of law requires a lot more definitiveness and than history. Just because maybe I think that because the stakes are the stakes and the effects of the claim are more immediate. Claims that get made in that arena. I mean, are there things, that said, let me answer the question I was actually asked. Are there things that people working in non-history fields take away from this, and in terms of using the use of the concept of agency? I hope so, right? I hope so. I hope that, an agency stands in sometimes for responsibility, right? Like not just kind of power, but also power to do, but also kind of responsibility for doing. Agency, sometimes stands in for a kind of intelligence, which is unfortunate that I just said that, and that confirms your humanity as a civilized human versus not. So agency, I think what it stands in for varies by fields, varies over time. And I think that what we don't want to presume is that how we deal with this concept, how we understand this concept is broadly shared. And, so my understanding of agency as being inherent is not a starting point of all historians. So, that's what I would say. I think that it works and it stands in, it implies, it presumes various things, and we really want to be, careful about migrating it between different fields, I think.
Yeah. Well, here's some questions that are therefore a little bit more specific, because there's such a range of things people want to know about, because your talk was so rich in detail. And since we don't have too much more time, I might put two of them together for you a little bit, and then I'll come back with a kind of final question. But one question is this: how has the youth agency of the apprentice been gendered in systems of tutelary servitude in West African nations like Nigeria? What are some of the legacies of that? How did systems of tutelary servitude participate in the histories of Western style education and cultural or traditional education in Nigeria? So that's one question, particularly developing on your very interesting comments on the apprenticing. And another one has to do with whether you have found examples of children being politically potent. Are children ever actors in a political sense, moving away from the word agency in some ways, but engagement in politics? Do you have any thoughts on, oh, you could either or both, whichever you prefer.
Thinking about apprenticeship in Nigerian history, or actually tutelary servitude, right, which I think is a good broader concept that accommodates that. Apprenticeships often were, enshrined in colonial laws, and one form of apprenticeship that I talk about in the article, it's not so much in Nigerian history, if the questioner doesn't mind, but was actually coming from Sierra Leone, which is not too far off. And apprenticeships, people were pressed into, so for example, Sierra Leone was a colony where captured people who were discovered on illegal slave trading ships were deposited and resettled and organized into this kind of missionary-run settlement. And one of the things that would happen when you first came off the ship was that you would be kind of assigned to one of the to one of the missionary societies, and would enter immediately into an apprenticeship with them, right? So a 7-year apprenticeship that would involve, living with that society, working for that society, performing labor for them, being educated by them sometimes. And this was a kind of routine and legally enshrined practice, a way to deal with the problem of captured people whose origins were unknown, right? And to bring them into the missionary society, socialize them into the new society. Sometimes people were young men and boys could be apprenticed into the Sierra Leone militia, right? And so this was another form of, and the language of how they are absorbed was like this apprenticeship language. And so, these forms were apprenticeship kind of commandeered their labor, allows for commandeering their labor, but also perhaps gave them some, opportunities to access these new forms of knowledge, for those who, for some, to lend their energies to expanding this free colony, right? To expanding the reach of this new free colony that they had been absorbed and socialized into. So it gave them some opportunities too for expressing their agency. Within Nigeria, I mean, the practice of entering, the apprenticeship follows a similar model as it does in many other parts of the world. It's the process of entering into professions, and learning various kinds of skills being brought into, you know, societies of experts, like smithing societies, farming societies, leatherworking, tanning, etc. Historically, tutelary servitude continues to play a role. That the combination of what Nar Milanish was talking about, this kind of paternalist caring aspect, this paternalist, paternalist caring aspect combined with the obligation to labor, still plays a role in not so much what I would call apprenticeships, but a kind of adoptions, a kind of a fostering, a traditional fostering system that integrates young, often maybe less wealthy, often in some way of people of poorer backgrounds, and integrates them into the households of people of wealthier backgrounds. And this is a practice that resembles apprenticeship, but I think is tutelary servitude captures it more, right? Because it's cast as a benevolent kind of fostering practice that combines training, right? So it's the fostering and the training together. And such practices are very prevalent, and I think feed on the gross economic inequality that exists in Nigeria and that produces a tremendous population of very, very poor families that might be motivated, right, to send their children into a fosterage, tutelary fosterage situation. So I forgot the other question.
It was about children and politics, but maybe we'll move on, just because we're going to run out of time. Alas, you've generated too many good thoughts to get to them all. I'll ask you one last question, though, if that's all right. And the question you can put aside for the moment, the question about politics, but just to end with the present, would you say? And this question is something I'm just curious about, so I'm using my prerogative as the conversant here. I was so struck by your description of children in the age of empire as, in fact, finding in some cases their capacity increased, that they were increasingly turned into young adults in some way rather than minoritized. And I'm wondering today, because it's such a hot topic, would you say that in the world today, maybe even in the time of COVID, are children or young people being increasingly juvenilized or increasingly sort of rendered mini adults without a separate childhood? And would the answer be the same if we were talking about New York or Lagos?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think both things are happening at the same time, right? On one hand, there's much discussion about the extension of the youth stage of life, right? Extension of childhood and youth and junior status, right? And a lot of that extension is a function of not being able to realize social adulthood, usually economically, not being able to realize it economically. And so, yeah, on one hand, childhood or youth, okay, maybe more youth seems to be elasticated in ways that it hasn't been before. On the other hand, I think Actually, I don't, there's no other hand. And I think that the patterns are similar in Lagos as in New York. You know, I think if anything, the patterns might have started in places like in Africa and have spread, you know, to include like places like New York in the US, which is to say that I think that the the experience of being closed out of full social adulthood starts, you know, that started in countries that were very, you know, that suffered from austerity measures, that had tremendous economic, you know, decline, crises. You know, a lot of those patterns, structural adjustments, a lot of those patterns started in Africa in the 70s and 80s, and you know, created various kinds of obstacles to meeting all the benchmarks of a life process that take one from youth into adulthood. And those same kind of economic forces, those same forces of economic compression and mass unemployment, you know, devaluation, all these things, they've gradually spread to other parts of the world as well, right? So, you know, Latin America and, you know, Asia in the 90s, you know, a bunch of financial crises in the US. And I think all of this has an impact on the capacity of young people to achieve the kind of full social adulthood that had been defined by your economic activity and your economic status in just a generation ago. So, you know, now everyone, you know, the gig economy, I think, is a reflection of that. The expansion of, you know, the return of internships. Everyone's got an internship. It's a kind of white collar apprenticeship. I think there are all kinds of signs of the muddying of the process of leaving youth.
That's a fascinating answer. I mean, I'm thinking about every bit of that, and I'm sure everybody who has any relationship to children these days, their own or others, grown, young, is thinking about these questions. So that seems like a wonderful place to end, and really thought-provoking, and precisely the ways history helps illuminate the present, and the present helps us ask good questions about the past. But that notion you just gave us of internships, that one is a particularly good one. We'll have to take that back to our students too, the new form of white collar apprenticeship. So Abosede, thank you so much for a long and wonderful conversation. It was fascinating from start to end. Thank you to our audience for listening, for sending in your good questions. Come back for our last sessions, and a big round of applause for our speaker, please. Thank you. And good night to all.